Thanks again for coming by. Really appreciate having you here. Maybe first you could start off by introducing yourself and the Sanctuary Cities for the Unborn project and explain how these ordinances work.
Okay. My name is Mark Lee Dickson, Director with Rights Life of East Texas and founder of the Sanctuary Cities for the Unborn initiative. So the Sanctuary Cities for the Unborn initiative has seen 50 cities pass ordinances outlawing abortion within their city limits. Many of those are in Texas, and most of those are in Texas. We have one in Louisiana, 2 in Nebraska, 2 in Ohio, and 1 in Iowa. And we are working hard to not just pass these in Texas, but all over the United States, because we need to see abortion outlawed everywhere.
Now, I understand that these ordinances are, to some degree, tailored to the needs of each city. But in general terms, maybe you could explain a little bit how these ordinances work and what makes them effective right now under Roe.
Absolutely. So these ordinances are written with a public enforcement mechanism and a private enforcement mechanism here in Texas. And the public enforcement mechanism is the city fines. And so those fines cannot be enforced unless one of several situations happen, including the overturning of Roe, but the private enforcement is immediate. And so right now, if an abortion were to happen in, say, Lubbock, Texas, then the citizens of Lubbock, Texas could sue the abortionist and anyone who's aiding and abetting the abortionist for the death of that unborn child.
Okay. So we're all waiting on the Dobbs ruling for Mississippi's 15-week gestational ban. If the Supreme Court does what it has signaled it will do and it reverses Roe v. Wade, what's that going to mean for that latter enforcement mechanism that you described? Are you going to keep pursuing civil enforcement in new cities afterward, or how's it going to look?
Absolutely. In fact, we'd be foolish not to. I mean, we just saw Austin, Texas say that they're not going to enforce any abortion ban, essentially. I mean, they're going to put it at the lowest spot of the totem pole, that they're not rushing towards this. And so what's going to happen in cities where the DAs or the mayor and council or the police department just chooses not to enforce the laws on the books? So what we need to make sure that this private enforcement mechanism is in laws all across the state of Texas pertaining to abortion, so that we can actually hold these abortionists accountable. We know that when this ordinance was passed in Lubbock, it shut down abortion completely from the moment of conception. So Planned Parenthood is not performing any abortions in Lubbock, Texas. They haven't performed any abortions since the ordinance went into effect on June 1st of 2021. And so over a year of this ordinance surviving, they lost in a lawsuit. They eventually appealed that to Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Planned Parenthood withdrew, and babies are saved in Lubbock. And we need to continue to make that fight across Texas. Texas Heartbeat Act was great, but of course, Texas Heartbeat Act only has private enforcement for children with a detectable heartbeat, abortions performed on them. And so we've got to make sure that from conception to detectable heartbeat, that stage of life is covered as well.
Sure. So for the vast majority of these sanctuary cities, y'all have simply proposed an ordinance to the city council and seen it passed. There are a minority of cities that have grown recently where you've gone about that a little bit differently. Maybe you could explain the city initiative process and how that varies from place to place and what that process looks like.
Absolutely. So some cities, their city councils represent their people really well. And other cities, the city councils don't represent their people really well. And you see this battling of the citizens of community against their leaders who are listening to their city attorney more than they're listening to their constituents. And so in those places, so we have, of course, we first saw this in Lubbock, and the citizens of Lubbock ended up collecting signatures, going through the citizen initiative process, and they got it on the ballot. And after their city council unanimously voted against it, and we saw 62% to 38% in the citizens' favor. Abortion became banned in Lubbock, Texas. The leaders of that city, the city council who voted against the ordinance, they've been in the process of being replaced. We got a new mayor in Lubbock right now who's very supportive of the ordinance. A number of council members very supportive of the ordinance. And so what we're seeing is in a place like Lubbock, those who stood against this ordinance, they were eventually replaced. In other places, we've tried to get this passed through the council, and they didn't like it, so we took to the initiative method as well. That'd be San Angelo, Abilene, Lindell, and Plainview. And out of those, Lindell's council changed their mind and decided to go ahead and pass the ordinance. But the other three councils, they voted against this ordinance, and so it's going to be on the November 8th ballot, and that's for San Angelo, Abilene, and Plainview. The only city that is currently collecting signatures right now to awaiting for once we collect the necessary number of signatures, the council will vote on it, and then if they vote it down, it will go to the people. That is the city of Athens, and so that is underway, and we are planning on turning in those signatures on Monday morning.
Okay. Lubbock was significant for a number of reasons, right? At the time, it was the biggest, correct? The
Absolutely.
biggest sanctuary city in the
Still is.
Okay. But on top of that, there was also a lawsuit that arose shortly after the ordinance was approved from Planned Parenthood. Maybe you could summarize how that went.
Planned Parenthood lost, and they appealed it, and they ended up withdrawing. And so right now there's no litigation open in the city of Lubbock. And in fact, nowhere in Texas is there litigation open. And so we're seeing so much success with this ordinance in Texas, and many cities are looking at passing similar versions, and hopefully we're wanting to see that pass by their mayor and city council. That this is not something that has to be decided by the people. In fact, this is a no-brainer situation. Do you want babies to be murdered in your city? If the answer is no, then you need to pass one of these ordinances and get it on the books. Because in the world that we're living in, we're seeing what's happening in Austin. We're seeing what's happening in all these liberal cities. Washington, D.C., for crying out loud, they are wanting to be a sanctuary for abortion. You got Sacramento, California. You got Oakland, California. That all these places are boldly standing up, and they're saying that they're going to be a sanctuary for reproductive rights, a sanctuary for abortion, or a sanctuary for all these. You know, they all say different things, but they're saying the same thing. That they want to be a place where abortions are protected in their city. And us conservatives, sometimes we're slow to the table, but we need to amp it up. We need to make sure that we are being bold and courageous, and we're standing for life. And if we have leaders in our community that aren't standing for life, that maybe they're a little bit shy about being pro-life, or shy about really stating that abortion is murder and that shouldn't be allowed in our communities, then maybe we need to find new leadership. And I think several cities are realizing that they've elected a bunch of nincompoops into office, and that we can't have that. We've got to make sure we have people that actually represent our beliefs and values.
On that same note, I think it's obvious to everybody what generally are the arguments for both sides of the abortion question on a national scale, right, in the left and right sense. But with regards to these heavily Republican areas, including Lubbock and Plainview, where city leadership putatively claims to be pro-life, I understand this would mostly be speculation on your part, but just theorizing, why do you think city leadership in some of these cities has been so reluctant to touch an ordinance that they would purportedly support?
I believe that many of our cities have been infiltrated by those who are liberal, those who are not really conservative, those who are Republican in name only, and I think it's a real problem. Look at the history of Athens, for instance. Athens is a very conservative community, about 14,000 people in Athens, but their history if you go back to 1968, there was a guy there by the name of Curtis Boyd, and Curtis Boyd was the county health officer at that time. He was a member of the Athens School Board, and he was best friends with an attorney by the name of Bill Kugel, who was the city attorney for Athens. There are so many connections to abortion and Roe v. Wade. Prior to Roe v. Wade coming down, you had Curtis Boyd was doing 10,000 illegal abortions in Athens, Texas, prior to Roe v. Wade. His best friend, the city attorney, he had to have known about what was happening. And in a documentary that was published years later, it reveals as much. That Curtis Boyd was business partners with one of the council members. And so the cover-up that takes place at government level, it's pretty scary. And you have these people like Bill Kugel, who was the city attorney at that time. He was good friends with Ann Richards, and Ann Richards, we know, funded Sarah Weddington's legislative campaign after Roe v. Wade, and that she was very involved in Sarah Hughes getting into her judge position. And of course, Sarah Hughes was the one that gave us Roe v. Wade. That she was the one that one of the three judges that when Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, Linda Coffey was actually a law clerk of Sarah Hughes. I believe that Roe v. Wade in its entirety was a political hack job. And so that's what we have to prevent from happening again. We've got to make sure that we have people in office that we trust that are going to represent our beliefs and values and aren't going to be pushing liberal agendas. Because Curtis Boyd, while he was on as county health officer performing 10,000 abortions, was also giving counsel to the Athens school nurse who was approaching the Athens school board saying that sex ed should be in the schools. So it's very, very nasty.
Long history in Athens. But real quick, maybe you could explain where the 10,000 number comes from.
So in a case, in Whole Woman's versus Paxton in 2017, Curtis Boyd, in his video deposition, ended up admitting to 10,000 abortions being performed in Athens, Texas. And so these would be illegal abortions in 1968, prior to Roe v. Wade. And so that's why Right to Life East Texas has put out an award of $10,000 for any information leading to the discovery of what Boyd did with these bodies. We want to know where these bodies are at. 10,000 bodies, that's a lot of bodies to dispose of. How did Boyd do this? And we're calling on the Athens Police Department and the Henderson County Sheriff's Department to open up an investigation, because this is a crime that was committed. And if Boyd ever steps foot in Henderson County again, which he has a lot of property there, then man, does he need to be held accountable for that.
So we skipped over a previous lawsuit that took place that the ACLU aided on behalf of several abortion funds. I want to say a couple dozen cities ago. Maybe you could sum that up real quick, when that happened and what the outcome of that case was.
So in 2020, 7 cities in East Texas were sued by the ACLU, and 3 months later, the ACLU withdrew that lawsuit. That lawsuit was over not actually the abortion ban, but around the edge issues in the ordinance. And of course, we ended up, we saw that for what it was, and we did make some tweaks to the ordinance, and we saw that the ordinances survive. And so the ACLU withdrew, and that's what we've seen, that from the very beginning, that these ordinances, they've been able to survive, that abortion remains banned in these cities, and we thank God for that. And these cities, looking back, they're proud of the decisions that they made. Wascom, there's a great mural in Wascom now, and it boldly states that Wascom is a sanctuary city for the unborn.
I'd love to get to the significance of Wascom in this movement. I was hoping real quick, maybe you could elaborate more concretely on the issue at the center of this lawsuit. Because I understand, as you said, the bans are still effective themselves. So what in particular, this is the murder designation in the findings section of these ordinances, correct? Or
Well, so you're talking about the Wascom lawsuit?
the lawsuit involving those 7 cities.
Okay,
Yes,
so
yeah.
on that, what happened is we were calling the abortion groups criminal organizations, and based on the pre-Roe statutes, that's true. They are criminal organizations based on the pre-Roe v. Wade statutes. Well, when they complained about that, but they said that we were limiting their freedom of speech, which we weren't. When they put up a billboard that said abortion is freedom, when I was asked what was going to happen, I said, well, we didn't outlaw freedom of speech, we outlawed the murder of innocent children. And so in that situation, we did go back in the ordinance and we removed a listing of, we had listed by name all these groups. Since they complained about that, we were like, well, the ordinance doesn't have to have that. And so we did remove that. Abortion was still outlawed. And so we also added a line in there that said nothing in this ordinance prohibits freedom of speech. And so we're just very clear on that note. They ended up withdrawing that lawsuit. Now, a few weeks after that, they ended up suing this guy named Mark Lee Dickson 3 different times for saying abortion is murder and that the abortion industry is involved in the murder of innocent children and that the abortion groups are criminal organizations based on the pre-Roe statutes. And so that, of course, is going through the courts right now. And so against me, the personal lawsuit, a defamation suit, and we saw in Dallas, Dallas ruled against us on that. The appeals court ended up ruling against us. In Austin, they ruled against us, and then it went on appeal, and, well, Austin appeals court was backed up, and so it was the case was relocated to Amarillo, and so Amarillo sided in my favor because they said, saying these things, it's within my rights. And so we ended up with what's called a circuit split. In West Texas, you can say abortion is murder and that the abortion industry is involved in the murder of innocent children and not fear a defamation lawsuit. But in East Texas, it could happen. And so the Texas Supreme Court is taking up that case, and we believe that the Texas Supreme Court will side with common sense and say that Amarillo was right.
Just to bring up one more lawsuit, not quite directly related to these ordinances, but more to state law. You were actually a defendant in a lawsuit that went up to the Supreme Court recently regarding the Texas Heartbeat Act. One of the court's few unanimous decisions in that case. Maybe you could explain how that went for you particularly in that lawsuit and what that was about to the best of your ability.
Absolutely. So I was the only named non-government actor in the lawsuit that went before Supreme Court of the United States on the Texas Heartbeat Act, and that was an exciting thing. It's always good to see truth prevail and good prevail, and that's what we saw happen there. We saw all 9 justices agree that the case against me should be dismissed, and not only that, we saw that that the only cases which could go forward, according to the Supreme Court, was the ones against those who were given out the medical licenses. And of course, that ended up, case went through the circles and goes back down, and Texas Supreme Court ended up, the way that they ruled, of course, cleared the Texas Heartbeat Act completely, and there was no path forward for the abortion industry. And so such a great victory, and as great as those victories are in the courts, the even greater victory is the fact that we have a law on the books that is that's saving lives, that babies with a detectable heartbeat, it's been over 9 months now that there are babies out there that are alive because the Texas Heartbeat Act is in effect, and we praise God for that.
Sure. So probably my last question, you mentioned Wascom earlier. That was the first sanctuary city for the unborn. anywhere. Maybe you could explain what gave you the idea in the first place way back in 2019 and what was going on at the time.
So at the time, there was an abortion facility in Shreveport, Louisiana that was, there was rumors circulating that they may be closing down due to some laws there in Louisiana that have been passed, and specifically the June Medical versus Russo case, which was before the Supreme Court of the United States at that time, and which was very similar to Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt in 2016. And of course, with the new makeup of the court, people were thinking that if Roberts were to rule as he did in Whole Women's versus Hellerstedt, then this was really good for us. And so what we knew is that back in the early 90s, the abortion industry had been offered land in a building that was in Wascom, Texas. Now, Wascom's about 18 miles to the west of Shreveport, Louisiana, and so Wascom being just across the Texas-Louisiana border. And so that was a concern. And I remember reaching out to the mayor of Wascom, and ended up, he said, "What can we do?" And I said, "You need to pass an ordinance outlawing abortion within city limits." And he said, "Expedite on that ordinance." And so I ended up at a Chick-fil-A in Longview, Texas, staring at this ordinance I came up with, and looking at this ordinance and eating some waffle fries and just enjoying Chick-fil-A. But I had so much weight on my back because I'm thinking, I don't want to see this city of Wascom sued into oblivion. I'm called to love my neighbor, and that's not just my unborn neighbor, that's my born neighbor as well. And so what happened, I texted my senator, Senator Brian Hughes over Senate District 1, and he ended up introducing me to Jonathan F. Mitchell, former Solicitor General of Texas, and we got on a conference call, the three of us, outside of Chick-fil-A, and Senator Hughes said, "Jonathan, do you think we could do with this what we're talking about doing with the Texas Heartbeat Bill?" And Jonathan said, "My thoughts exactly." And so I said, "What are y'all planning on doing Texas Heartbeat Bill?" And they explained this private enforcement mechanism. And we ended up seeing Wascom be the first to pass this type of enforcement mechanism in Texas relating to abortion. And of course, they were not the last. And so that was a very exciting development as we saw city after city start passing these ordinances. And we heard the arguments from the other side. And hearing those arguments from the other side allowed senators and representatives to know kind of what was going to come, and allowed those working on the bill to really refine it even more and more.
Maybe you could explain how, in general trends, the ordinances have evolved since Wascom, right? They're including insurance now and making certain abortifacient drugs contraband.
So the ordinances have evolved, and it's one of those things where the ordinances have evolved because of course, when the legislature meets, they pass laws. And so we're able to do more. We're able to close up loopholes. We're seeing more and more things that can be done. And so we don't just want to stay, at the how little can we do, but we're saying how much can we do? How much stronger can we make these ordinances? And so not all the ordinances, but some of the newer ordinances that we're looking at right now, and that actually the ones that are being put forth in places like Athens, and the ones that will be on the ballot in San Angelo and Abilene and Plainview, those ordinances have built into them that it's not just outlawing abortion performed on a resident of performed within the city limits of that community, but it's actually outlawing abortion on a resident of those communities.
Regardless of where that abortion might take place.
Exactly. So if that abortion were to happen in Washington, D.C., or New York or New Mexico, or California, that there are things into effect that can hold those who are ending the lives of that child accountable.
That's all I got, Mark. Thanks so much for talking to me. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.